Welcome to adding and subtracting rational expressions, and we're just going to focus on monomial denominators in this lesson. So to add a rational number expression, we need a common denominator, just like how we would when we want to add or subtract fractions. And if one doesn't exist, you have to use the multiply or divide by one property in order to create a common denominator. Your lowest common denominator is always the best option. So your LCD, your lowest common denominator, must contain the greatest number of any factor that appears in the denominator of either the fraction or rational expression. If a factor appears once in both expressions, include it only once, and if it appears twice, then include it twice. Once both numbers and expressions have the same denominator, you can combine them by performing the operation on the numerator, then writing the solution over the same common denominator. So let's go ahead and do an example of this. Determine the lowest common denominator for the rational expression. If we take a look at the first rational, we have x minus 3 and x plus 3. So those two must be included in our LCD. And then looking at our next one, we have x minus 3, x minus 3. So there's a duplicate of x minus 3. In my LCD right now, I only have one x minus 3, but we need to have two because that one has 2. So I'm just going to square the x minus 3. This would be our full LCD. Let's do another example where we actually add or subtract. So if we look at our denominator for A, we already have B as our LCD, and we don't need to change a thing because it already has the same common denominator. But we're going to state the NPVs first before we go ahead and simplify. Your NPV for this one, well, B equals 0 would create a problem because we would have 0 in the denominator. So that is our only NPV. Now from here, all I have to do is subtract our numerators and leave the denominator alone. Remember to keep the a minus 1 in brackets because the negative here affects all the terms in the numerator. Now I'm going to distribute that negative to each term in the bracket and then combine like terms. So 2a minus a is just a left the plus 1 over b. Moving on to our next example. Again, we already have the same common denominator, which is x minus 2, so I don't need to find an LCD or lowest common denominator. Then my next step is to find the NPVs. And there's only one, which would be x equals 2, because if x was 2, we would get 2 minus 2 in the denominator, and then we would get a 0, and that would cause a problem. Now we just need to combine our numerators and leave the denominator alone. So our numerator is x squared plus 3x minus 10. And then from here we can factor our numerator, because you might be able to cancel something out in our numerator and our denominator in order to get the simplest form. Factors of 10 are 5 and 2, and we can get a plus 3 middle term if we had a positive 5 and a negative 2. Now we can see that we can cancel out x minus 2 from the numerator and the denominator, and then we're left with x plus 5. Because we started with a rational, remember that your NPV is still going to be x minus 2 despite that our simplified version is x plus 5. Moving on to our next example, C. In this case, we do need to find an LCD because our denominators are not the same. So just focusing on our coefficients, we have a 5 and we have a 4 in the other one. So in order for us to have an LCD, we had to combine the 4 and the 5 by multiplying them together, which is 20. We have one A, so I'm going to include that. And then we have at most two B's, so I'm going to include that as well. So that is our LCD. I'm kind of just combining everything all together. So the 5 and the 4, we just multiply. We have one A, so we'll include that. And this one has a B, but this has greater power, so I'm going to include B squared instead of just B. Then my next step is to multiply each rational in order to get that LCD. So I'm just going to rewrite my fractions or my rationals here, and then we'll determine what we're going to multiply by. So for our first rational, in order to get 20ab squared in our denominator, I would need to multiply this by 4 to get 20. We already have the a, but then I also need another b, so I have to multiply by b. And I'm going to do this top and bottom. And if you want to check our denominator, we would have 20ab squared, which is exactly what we want for our LCD. For our next one, I need to multiply the 4 by 5 in order to get 20, and we don't have an a, so I'm going to multiply by that as well. It already has the b squared, so I don't need to insert b in there. And I have to multiply by 5a, then top and bottom. Now let's go ahead and do this. So in our numerator for our first rational, we're going to have 16b because we just multiply across. And then our denominator, we're going to get back the LCD that we wanted. In our second rational, 3 times 5a is 15a. And then we get back our LCD. Now we're going to subtract our numerator. And I'm just going to leave it as 16b minus 15a all over 20ab squared. There's nothing we can do to simplify this, so I'm going to leave it as that. We didn't state our NPV, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. We have two variables, a and b, and in this case, a equals 0 or b equals 0 will give us a problem because we'll have a 0 in the denominator. Moving on to our next example, we're going to do quite a bit here. So for this one, again, we need to find the LCD. In our first denominator in the rational, we have xy. So I'm going to have to include xy for sure in our LCD. In our next one, we have an x squared. So that means I'm going to include an x squared instead of just an x in our LCD. And this is just a 3 with a 1 in the denominator. So we don't need to worry about that for our LCD at all. So for D, I'm going to then write out my rationals again. So I'm going to determine what I'm going to multiply by for each rational in order to get the same LCD. For our first rational, in order to get x squared y in the denominator, I'm going to multiply top and bottom by x. For our next rational, I need to multiply by y top and bottom. And then lastly, for 3, I'm going to do x squared y top and bottom because it doesn't have anything in the denominator. Okay, so for our numerator, for the first rational, we're going to get 2x squared over x squared y. Then 4y over x squared y minus 3x squared y over x squared y. And the last thing we're going to do is write it under one denominator. So we're going to have 2x squared plus 4y minus 3x squared y all over x squared y. And that is our simplified form. There's nothing for us to factor out in our numerator. It doesn't have any common terms. I'm going to state the NPVs. So we have two variables, x and y. And if either of them are 0, that's when we're going to have an undefined rational. For our next one in E, it's very similar to our last one. We want to find the LCD. for our coefficient though, we're going to have to combine the 3 and the 5. They have nothing in common. So we're going to go with 15 because that's 5 times 3. Our next variable, we have a c. The highest power is c squared. And then we have a d. So that's our LCD. I'm going to rewrite our rationals again so we can decide what we're going to multiply by. Okay, so for our first rational, in order to get 15c squared d, I'm going to need to multiply top and bottom by 5 to get 15, and also a c to get c squared. For our next rational, I'm going to need to multiply by just 3, top and bottom. It already has c squared d in the denominator. Okay, let's simplify this. So this 5c is going to go into the 3 and to the 2. And this 3 is going to go into the c and into the 8. So we're going to have 5c times 3c, which is 15c squared. And then 5c times negative 2, which is negative 10c. Our next rational, the 3 is going to go with the c, so it's 3c plus 8 times 3 is 24. And then our LCD on the bottom. Now I can write this under one denominator. Remember, this negative would have to distribute to each term, which is why I have a negative 24 there. Okay, now I'm going to combine our like terms. And we're just going to leave it at that. Our NPVs is c equals 0 and d equals 0. For the next two, I want you to try these ones on your own, and then when you're ready, press play for the full solution. So here's our solution for f. Your LCD should be 24x squared. Now, if you did end up using 8 times 6, which is 48, and then your LCD would have been 48x squared, that is completely fine as well. You should get the same answer in the end, but it's not a lowest common denominator. Your lowest common denominator would be a factor, or a product, that would be in common between 8 and 6, and it would be the lowest one. And 48 would not have been the lowest one. But again, if you decide to use 48x squared, it's not wrong, it's just not an LCD. So after that, I multiplied by 3x top and bottom to the first rational in order to get 24x squared as our LCD in the denominator. Then for the second rational, multiply top and bottom by 4. Your final answer from either method for your common denominator should be 3x squared minus 11 minus 28 over 24x squared. And your NPVs here should only be 1 because we have one variable and it's x equals 0. Moving on to the next example. Here our LCD is 12a squared. You could have done 2 times 4 times 3 if you wanted to for your LCD. Again, it wouldn't be called an LCD anymore because it's not the lowest one. It would just be a common denominator. So if you used 2 times 4 times 3 as part of your common denominator, again, that is fine. You should still get the same answer in the end, but really your LCD should be 12a squared because we can multiply 2 by 6 to get 12. We can multiply 4 by 3 to get 12. We can multiply 3 by 4 to get 12. Then after that, again, in order to get our LCD, I figured out which I need to multiply by in order to get that LCD. So the first one I multiplied by 6a squared. The next rational I multiplied by just 3. And then finally the last rational I multiplied by 4a. Your final answer should be 30a squared minus 8a minus 9 over 12a squared. Let's do this last example together. We're going to figure out what number we're going to use and what numbers in common between 8, 3, and 6 for products. I can get a 24 if I multiply 8 by 3 and 3 by 8, and also 6 times 4 gives us 24. Then for our variable, we just have a z to worry about, so our highest power for z is squared, so I'm going to use the 2 there. I'm going to state the NPVs as well, and it'll just be z equals 0 for this one. Now I'm going to rewrite our fraction, our rational. And then we're going to figure out what we're going to multiply each rational by to get the LCD in there. Okay, for our first rational, I'm going to multiply this by just 3 top and bottom because we already have the z squared in the bottom. For our next rational, I'm going to multiply this by 8z top and bottom. So we can get the z squared and we can get the 24. And then lastly, I'm going to multiply our last rational by 4z squared. Now we're going to simplify. So I'm going to multiply the 3 into the 2x and the 1, or the 2z rather. So that would be 6z plus 3 over our LCD. Then for our next rational, I'm going to multiply this 8z with the 4z and with the 4, which is 32z squared minus 32z. And then lastly, multiply the 4z squared with the 8 and the negative z. So we're going to get 32z squared minus 4z cubed. Now I can put this all under one denominator, that's 6z plus 3 plus 32z squared minus 32z. The negative is for the entire numerator in our last rational, so it's going to be negative 32z squared plus 4z cubed. And we're going to now simplify our numerator to collect like terms. So we have 4z cubed. Our z squared, 32z squared is going to cancel out. So we have 6z minus 32z, which is 26z. And then we have the plus 3 remaining. We're just going to leave it like that.